Welcome to the latest program in our In the Thick of It series, which brings together journalists reporting from hotspot regions. Today, our panelists will discuss how wars involving the U.S., Iran, and Israel are playing out across the Middle East, raising the risk of wider escalation and regional spillover. All of our panelists are on the ground. And so they'll tell us what life looks like where they are, the broader geopolitical stakes, and what may happen next. They'll talk for about half an hour and then take questions. Please put all your questions in the chat at any time. So now I will introduce today's moderator, Mohamad Bazzi. He's director of the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at New York University and an associate professor of journalism. So he's here in New York. From 2009 to 2013, he served as adjunct senior fellow for the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining the NYU faculty, Mohamad was the Middle East bureau chief at Newsday from 2003 to 2008, where he established bureaus in Baghdad and Beirut. He was the lead writer on the Iraq War and its aftermath. Mohamad has also cooperated with the OPC to host programs for students at NYU. Thank you, Mohamad, for jumping in on very short notice. We are very grateful. Now I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the OPC for asking me, and thank you for organizing this panel. I'm going to introduce our speakers, some just brief bios to contextualize everyone and where they are, and then we'll get into our discussion. So Nabih Bulos is the Middle East bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. Since 2012, he has covered the aftermath of the Arab Spring revolutions, as well as the resurgence of ISIS and the campaign to defeat it throughout the Middle East. His work has taken him to Syria, Iraq, Libya, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Yemen, as well as the migrant trail through the Balkans and Northern Europe. A Fulbright scholar, Bulos is also a concert violinist. Heidi Pett is the
Syria. Old bio. I really have to update it.
Sorry. Okay. Well,
I really have to update the bio. Sorry, pardon me. I really have to update this bio. I forgot to do so.
Okay, that's okay. We can update it in the course of the discussion too. Okay, Heidi Pett is the Syria correspondent for Al Jazeera English. She's based in Damascus. She's been based in Damascus since shortly after the fall of the Assad regime. She's been based in Lebanon for the most part over the last 2 months since the start of the Iran war. She specializes in international news and investigations, and especially in narrative podcasts, TV news, and radio documentaries. And her work has appeared in outlets including The Economist, the BBC, Channel 4 News, Politico, and ABC. So she's been in Beirut, but today she's joining us from Damascus. She's been in Beirut and traveling throughout Lebanon, and we'll talk about that. Stephen Kalin is a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in the Middle East, where he's lived since 2009. He moved to Riyadh in 2017 to cover the rise of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the social, economic, and political shifts that have been underway in the kingdom. He's reported on every major development in contemporary Saudi Arabia and its Gulf neighbors. Stephen previously worked for Reuters for 7 years, and he's also been reporting from Ukraine after the Russian invasion in 2022. He's done that for the Journal. And finally, Daniel Estrin is NPR's international correspondent based in Jerusalem. Since joining NPR in 2017, he has reported from Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the UAE. He and his team were awarded an Edward R. Murrow Award for a 2019 report challenging the U.S. military's account about its raid against the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Before joining NPR, Daniel worked for the AP for 7 years. Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with with Stephen, who is recently reporting out of Kuwait, and he's been covering the fallout of the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. He's been covering the fallout, especially on Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, other Gulf states that have been in the crosshairs of this war. So in that on the ground reporting that he's been doing from Kuwait, from Saudi, and elsewhere, um, he's also draws on his experience having covered Iraq for a long time. And I think one of the themes that you've been writing about, Stephen, is the role of the Iraqi militias in this war. One of the things that was very interesting out of your piece is you noted out of this piece from Kuwait that possibly half of the drone strikes in Saudi Arabia had actually originated uh, out of the Shia militias in Iraq. So can you tell us a bit about the role of Iraq, which is, I think, something we haven't seen a lot of coverage on in the US, and partly this is a complicated war. It's a multi-front war involving Iran, Israel, the US. Lebanon has been a huge part of this war, but that role of the Iraqi militias, Iran's allies in Iraq, and how they've targeted the GCC states. So let's start with that, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Mohamad. I think it is it's an important part of this conflict that I think hasn't gotten sort of due attention, partly because there, as you said, there is so much else going on. I mean, there's first, the bombing in Iran, the retaliation across the Gulf states, as well as Jordan and Israel. And obviously the debacle through the Strait of Hormuz. There's so many aspects of this that we're all trying to cover. I think so Iraq unfortunately gets sort of short shrift in the last couple of months. Something that caught our attention early on. One of my colleagues wrote, I think it was the beginning of March, about a series of U.S. Of what. Pretty confident, U.S. raids in Iraq and strikes against Iraqi militia leaders in places like Jarfa, just outside of Baghdad, that again went sort of under the radar because there was so much else going on at the time. And then when I went to Saudi about sort of the middle of March, end of March. It kind of struck me at how many people there were talking about the Iraqis, but that really I hadn't heard much about it until I got there. That a lot of the attacks had been coming from the north of Saudi, not just the east. And then I actually spent last week in Kuwait, and obviously they are sort of pre-programmed to have a paranoia about the Iraqis, and in this case, that it's well founded. They also think that perhaps half of the drone attacks that have come against them have come from Iraqi militias, and they're particularly concerned about that. Obviously, there's a historical concern there, given the Saddam's invasion 35 years ago. But there's also the sense that this Iraqi government has even less control over the militias than previous ones did. There's a power vacuum in Baghdad. They're just sort of moving forward on the process of selecting a prime minister after elections last year. And there's also a sense that the militias, there's less control over the militias. Obviously, command and control of the IRGC is something of a question that we're involved in trying to understand a little bit better after sort of the decapitation of the regime in Tehran, and in terms of not just political, but also a lot of the top military leaders, both last summer and then the beginning of this conflict. A lot of questions about whether, how autonomously some of these units are operating. I think in Iraq that is exacerbated. There's a sense that the Iranians don't really have command and control over a lot of these groups. That may also be partly a convenient sort of plausible deniability that these groups attack in the name of a sort of a fictitious name, just to be able to have plausible deniability. But those essentially they're continued to send attacks across the borders even after the ceasefire went into effect and after the Iranians began respecting it after the first 24 to 36 hours last month. So the Kuwaitis also interestingly have a concern about that their physical border, which I didn't pick up when I was in Saudi. They're more concerned about these aerial attacks. The Kuwaitis have I think it's a 160-mile border with Kuwait. With Iraq, I went up to the border last week. It is pretty flat and open and very sort of hard to defend. You'd have to imagine that even with a lot of the American troops having left some of their bases after the war began, there's still quite a lot of reconnaissance of that border, and that any infiltration would be detected. But that's certainly a worry that I picked up while I was in Kuwait.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. We'll come back to some more questions about the situation in GCC. Sort of moving outward from Iran, I want to ask Nabih and Heidi about Lebanon, which is sort of short of Iran, has suffered the most destruction of this war, and actually per capita, the death toll in Lebanon is significantly higher than the death toll in Iran. So I want to ask you both about what you've been reporting. You both reported from southern Lebanon, and you've both reported from Beirut extensively. You both reported on the attacks on April 8th, which is the morning after the first iteration of the ceasefire went into effect. Those 100 Israeli airstrikes within 10 minutes across Beirut, across the Bekaa, across southern Lebanon, that really terrified the people of Lebanon. It spread panic, it spread terror throughout Lebanon. So we can tell us a bit about that and the aftermath of those attacks, and also this situation in the south right now where the Israeli military is bulldozing and dynamiting wholesale towns. There are about 55 towns that are being occupied by Israeli forces right now. So anything you can shed light on these questions? Maybe let's start with Heidi and then go to Nabih. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, in terms of April 8th, you're right. It was just a completely terrifying day for most people across Lebanon. I was actually, at that point, I was working the night shift, right? And so I was awake at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning local time when the announcement was made about the Iran-Israel-US ceasefire. And then there was a sort of, there was a bit of confusion in Lebanon. Does this apply to us? And then there was a tweet actually by the Pakistani Prime Minister, which came about an hour afterwards, so sort of 3 o'clock in the morning local time, which said, yes, this ceasefire applies to Lebanon. And at that point, people actually started going home, right? Like the highways south started getting busy before dawn that day. And it was at 6 a.m. local time that then you had this announcement from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, no, ceasefire doesn't apply. And so there was this sort of confusion. There were people who still continued going south, going back into Dahia, wanting to go home, check on their houses, things like that. I went to sleep at that point and then woke up at when these strikes happened, right, at 2 p.m. local time. And it just like the whole city shook. And so heading out and speaking to people about that, I remember having a conversation with one person who said, like, we couldn't understand why it took so long for the emergency services to arrive, because it was, it's a personal tragedy for every person when their apartment gets blown up, when somebody in their family is killed by an airstrike. And in that initial moment, there wasn't really any understanding of the scale of what had happened, right? Each person thought it was just their apartment building that had been destroyed. And as it turns out, no, it's, more than 10 in Beirut, more than 100 across the country. And so it was just, I think, as a journalist, but also as a person in Lebanon, it took a while to even really, we're in all these WhatsApp groups with other journalists and even our small one for the newsroom. And someone said, oh, there was a strike in, I think it was in downtown. And then someone else jumped in and said, no, it wasn't in downtown, it was here. And even amongst ourselves, it was a moment of, oh no, hang on, it's everywhere. They hit the entire country at once, which was just the scale of that, it was more than, they're still counting the toll from that day. They're still trying to do DNA testing and identify actually how many people died, but it was more than 350 people killed. And, Beirut was just, the whole city smelled like explosives. It was, the impact was enormous. And it was such a frightening, terrifying, and confusing and disappointing day for many people in Lebanon who had really hoped that regional ceasefire was going to apply. And then the Israeli military just made it so incredibly clear that it didn't. And there's still ongoing debate and questions within Lebanon, right, about whether a ceasefire is stronger if it's applied within that regional framework, if it's tied to whatever is happening in Iran, or you have the position of the Lebanese government, which says, no, this is an issue of sovereignty. Nobody else is negotiating on our behalf. We are going to negotiate and apply a separate ceasefire, which is what is ostensibly happening at the moment. But anytime you're anywhere in South Lebanon, it's very, very clear that while, yes, there's a ceasefire in Beirut, which hasn't been struck since the 16th of April, the strikes in South Lebanon are constant. The windows are shaking. You hear the warplanes overhead. There's the airstrikes, there's the demolitions, there's artillery shelling, there's white phosphorus. It's constant all day, every day. And that's in the zone that the Israelis are ostensibly trying to occupy or to control, to say nothing of the ways that they're extending control over the population in South Lebanon north of that, trying to depopulate. And Nabih actually had a really good piece out that came out today about the ways that they're using control of the telecommunications network to identify targets and to place these terrifying phone calls, which is something I've actually been working on as well. So I saw your piece come out today, Nabih, and I was like, damn. He beat me to it again. But it's an incredible piece of journalism about the way that Israel selects and then identifies and then places calls to targets. And maybe you can talk a bit more about it.